Again, welcome everybody. This is the virtual meeting for the Town of Holly Springs Parks, Recreation, and Greenways Master Plan update. It is 6:30. We have about, it looks like about 30 attendees on the call at the moment. Hopefully we'll get a few more of our community members to join us, but we want to be mindful of your time, so we are going to go ahead and get started. We've got a great program plan for you. We're very excited to share with you the recommendations of the hard work that the team has put together over the past several months. This has actually almost been a year-long planning process thus far. So we'll go ahead and get started. Shweta, if you want to go ahead and move us to the next slide. So I just want to lay this out. I'm Leanne Plummer, the Holly Springs Parks and Recreation Director. I will introduce the team here in just a second, but I want to share with you what to expect tonight during our presentation. Our consultant, McAdams, is a planning firm. The town has retained them in order to do this analysis and create this 10-year planning document for the Parks and Recreation Department. So they're going to share the work that they've done, basically what they've heard from the community through the numerous surveys, the public meetings, the focus groups, and so on that have occurred. They're going to introduce the guiding principles that was collected from that information. There were several themes that came out of the analysis that was done, and they will share what those guiding principles are. Then they're going to get into the fun stuff, at least from my side. They're going to share the key recommendations that this plan is going to put forth. This will be, again, our 10-year planning document, and look at these action items that the town will hopefully be undertaking over the next 10 years based on the feedback and, of course, the adoption from town council. There will be time at the end of our meeting for a Q&A. So please be sure to type your questions in the Q&A box or in the chat box, and we'll show you where those are on the Zoom webinar here. And then lastly, at the end, there will also be an opportunity to log into our public input site again. And from these recommendations, we're going to ask you to create some priorities for us. So we're going to show you some recommendations, and we need help from the public to kind of share with us what your priorities are from these recommendations. So we will kind of jump ahead to some of the housekeeping items. Shweta, if you want to move. So the Zoom webinar tips, again, at the bottom of your box, if you haven't been on a Zoom call recently, the two boxes are the chat box and the Q&A box. Those are both available to you as webinar attendees to ask any questions that you may have throughout the course of the meeting tonight. Depending on our time, we may try to answer a few questions midstream, and then certainly at the end, we're going to hang on until we answer as many questions that are out there. I also want to point out that this meeting is being recorded this evening to be shared on the town's website, so that those that were not able to attend will have a chance to view and hear these recommendations. So without further ado, again, I want to introduce the project team. As I indicated, I'm Leanne Plummer, the Parks and Recreation Director for Holly Springs. Joining us tonight is Matt Beard. He's also with the town. He is our park planner and has been leading the effort of this project. From the McAdams team, we have Rachel Cotter. She is the project manager. We have Shweta Nedeker. She's a landscape architect and will be taking us through some of the recommendations. Eric Melville is joining us tonight as the Greenway planner from McAdams. And we are also honored to have Leon Younger. He is the principal from Pros Consulting, which is a nationwide parks and recreation consulting firm based out of Indiana. So he is showing us some best practices across the nation for these recommendations for our plan. So we're glad to have Leon as part of our team.
Thanks so much, Leanne. We are so excited to be here tonight with all of you and really want to thank you for your time and for joining this presentation online. We wish we could be in person with all of you, but we are excited that we do have the opportunity to present these recommendations virtually. The process that we've gone through that's taken nearly a year started with a lot of research and community engagement. We've synthesized all the findings, and tonight we're going to be presenting those in the form of the plan's guiding principles and recommendations. The last step we have is to finalize the comprehensive plan based on the comments we hear this evening and have this entire plan adopted by your council. So you're going to see this chart or this graphic at the bottom of every slide at the bottom left. So in summary of our community engagement, number 2, we wanted to share with you the results of that process. You were part of that process last time as part of the public input meeting that we facilitated. We had excellent and broad community engagement throughout the process. We had over 57 participants in steering committees and with elected officials. We distributed a statistically valid scientific survey and had responses from 351 households. We had 120 participants at the last public meeting and responding to the online surveys, and we had a number of focus groups with various target topics that had over 40 participants. This is very much a community-driven plan, so all of your input was very valuable to the guiding principles that were developed. Next slide. And this is exactly how we did it. So we took all of the community engagement and the results of the scientific survey, and we realized a number of themes. So for example, participants indicated that the Farmers Market Pavilion was one of the top priority investments for growth. And 97% of respondents indicated that Parks and Recreation is an essential service to the town. Participants indicated that fitness and wellness programs were one of the top priorities for investment. And 52, so over half of survey respondents indicated greenway trails as the most important facilities. 81% of respondents are supportive of a future bond within existing property tax structure to fund parks and recreation improvements and expansions. 86% of survey respondents support implementing sustainable measures to minimize environmental impacts. We heard that loud and clear during the last public input meeting, so thank you for those of you who were also joined us at that time. We took that very seriously. And then 93% of respondents rated the overall quality of programs, special events as excellent. So these little icons here and how we grouped or noticed the themes from all the community engagement, next slide, were the key to our guiding principles. So again, we took all of this input from you all, from the focus groups, from the scientific survey, synthesize that into the guiding principles, which are balanced growth, equity and access, health, connectivity, financial sustainability, environmental awareness, and excellence. So throughout all of the recommendations, these are the themes that the recommendations are tied to. So over time, as the town's situation changes, whether that's availability of resources or recreation trends, some of the goals or objectives themselves might change slightly, but together the guiding principles don't change. Those are really rooted in the community's interests and the community values. So we're going to start with balanced growth. And balanced growth is really about meeting the needs of a growing community, but in a way that manages and maintains the small town character of Holly Springs. So we're recommending that the town acquire 186 additional acres of parkland over the next 10 years. And the town currently has 150 acres that they own that could be developed over the next 10 years as parks and recreation facilities. We're also recommending that the town construct an additional 53,000 to 80,000 square feet of indoor recreation space. Indoor recreation space is very much in demand for additional programming, athletic courts, offices, and storage. The difference there is based on the need or the desire for an aquatics program and what types of amenity or facility space it would take to achieve some sort of an indoor aquatics facility. And then we're recommending that the town diversify the recreation and cultural arts programs and amenities. Next slide.
So this is one of the outcome of the recommendations for balanced growth. It shows the park search areas map. If it is not legible on your small screens at home, these maps will also be available on the online engagement tool and the website, so you can take a closer look at these maps. So what this map is showing us is the big purple blobs that you see on this map. These are the 10-minute walks from existing parks. And the orange bubbles that you see that have been numbered, these are the gaps that exist currently within the town of Holly Springs. Just to orient you on this map, this is Highway 55. This is 540 coming north of Holly Springs area. So basically, many of the park recommendation search areas have been concentrated towards west of 55, is what we had heard from community engagement process too. The numbers that you see correspond with what amenities would be suitable for these park search areas. The colors on this map also correspond to the future land use plan. So based on what the future land use will look like in Holly Springs, the amenities for recreation would be suited for those, and we will touch base on that on the next slide. But for example, if we are looking at business districts or innovation districts, the recreation amenities might be different than what would you see in single family neighborhoods or multi-use neighborhoods, etc. So let's move on to the next slide. This shows some of the amenities that would be appropriate for these park search areas. Greenway trails came up, as you know, the topmost priority. Plazas and multi-use greens would be some of the amenities that would be suitable for, let's say, business district or mixed use developments. Community gardens would be recommended in conjunction with the beloved farmers market area. Dog parks are another amenity, and splash pad component, inclusive play to make sure we are addressing the needs of our special needs population. And then finally, the conservation areas. We want our community to get in touch with close to nature and having these low impact amenities in the conservation areas like treetop trails, adventure areas, but also having small scale amenities for our littlest population within Holly Springs. Some of the program recommendations associated with these include environmental education, indoor basketball programming, aquatics can include indoor and outdoor pools, diversity of cultural programs to make sure we are addressing the needs of diverse Holly Springs population. And then programs for various age groups, including special needs, seniors, and teens. Health and wellness programs to make sure we are addressing the mental health issues within the community. And then taking advantage of the natural resources within Holly Springs and extending them for creating these outdoor programmings.
The next guiding principle is centered around providing equitable and inclusive access to all residents and visitors to Holly Springs. The first way to achieve that is through equitable distribution of parkland, especially west of NC 55. As you saw on the park search area map that Shweta showed, there are some gaps, and we've identified those gaps, and we're proposing parks be developed in those areas. The second goal for achieving equity is to increase the percentage of residents within a 10-minute walk of a park. Currently, it's 41%. The national standard is closer to 55. So we're recommending the town try to achieve the national standard over the next 10 years through development of greenway trails, sidewalks, and working with the private development community as developments are constructed. We also want to provide access to all ages and ability levels. So as parks come online or renovations are completed, accessibility and inclusivity will be top of mind. And finally, we'll want to develop program plans for special needs populations.
Before I jump to the next guiding principle, I want to also request all our participants that we do have the question and answer set box open here. So if you have any questions, please type them in here and we will be answering them throughout the presentation. So I'm going to move on to the next one, the health guiding principle. The first recommendation that we have here is really planning, designing, and programming to improve the health outcomes that are related to physical fitness, making sure we are providing low, medium, and high activity recreation amenities for all of the Holly Springs residents, making sure that we are addressing the mental health needs of the community. And the timing couldn't be perfect. We are experiencing how our social life has been impacted with COVID. As the restaurants are closed, other social places where we meet our friends and family are closed, parks and recreation has become that essential service where we are out in the open space and socializing, making sure at a safe distance. And so that really brings up that benefit of parks and recreation services in these times. Other times too, there is a growing evidence about how parks and recreation services help with the mental health issues. Just being outside for a few minutes in a day, being in contact with nature reduces the ADHD symptoms. It helps with anxiety disorders. And so we really want to focus on the mental health aspects while we are designing and programming our recreation spaces. Social cohesion is another aspect of that. While we are out and about in our parks and greenways, we meet other people. When we engage in the recreation programs, we inspire each other to try something new. And these interactions start to build the social capital within the community. It starts to bring in that more community feeling within Holly Springs. And we want to emphasize that benefit of parks and recreation. Healthy eating is the last component of that. Access to food is an important aspect. We heard how Holly Springs residents love the farmers market, and we want to leverage that resource in creating healthy eating habits, making sure people are aware, creating educational resources about healthy eating would be part of these recreation and program recommendations. And finally, the strategic partnerships. We want the town to identify the local organizations, nonprofit organizations, and other community partners, healthcare providers who are interested in these health outcomes, and create that beneficial partnerships to extend diverse programming to Holly Springs residents. So before we jump to the next guiding principle, are there any questions anyone wants to type in our chat box, in the Q&A box? We do have a question here in our chat box. Any progress on acquiring a little bit of the land north of Ting from Wake County to utilize the existing underpass on 55 to connect Ting Park to 12 Oaks? I will direct that question to our town staff.
Matt, if you want to join in, we are looking at making that Greenway connection. We recognize that opportunity of that underpass right there north of Ting. The county right now, I think, is looking at that land to do some development, and the town is working with them to create partnership and making sure that we have access to the Greenway to make that connection. And so that is going to be part of our Greenway conversation that we're going to talk about shortly, because that is one of the aspects of the plan. But if there's anything else, Matt, any other information you can share relative to our efforts on that area? Are you stuck on mute, Matt? Shweta, can you unmute the panelists by chance? I don't know if that's a setting that got pushed.
Yeah, we can try that.
There we go. Oh, maybe not. We'll have to come back to that question maybe later on, Matt, if we can get your microphone working. But again, just to try to add some additional insight, we're definitely aware of that connection, and that is part of our Greenway, one of our Greenway recommendations, and Eric will be talking about that shortly. So we can also follow up. Any other, there were a couple of other questions maybe.
We do have another question here. Was the current funding approved in the 2011 Parks and Recreation bond considered as primary funding, or will additional bonds be required for the master plan?
So I can answer a little bit about the remaining bonds that were part of the 2011 bond project. There's $8 million of those bonds remaining. 4 million of those have been earmarked to pay for the acquisition of that new parkland that the town acquired in January west of 55. And some of that money will also be utilized for phase 1 development of that park. The phase 1 would really look at the infrastructure and hopefully some passive recreational uses. The remaining funding we are anticipating will be utilized for the Arbor Creek, Middle Creek Greenway project. And the construction of that, and that is currently under design. So those bond funds have been earmarked for those projects to date. We do anticipate, and we'll be talking about some strategies later on with some of the other recommendations about how the town would have to create some other funding opportunities and some sustainable funding resources in order to continue to build out the park system. And again, those recommendations will be coming shortly in this plan as well.
Great, thank you, Leanne. We can take one more question here. I have a question about a park east of cemetery. Does the plan for a park east of the cemetery still exist?
So I think that references what we call the MIMS property in the downtown area. And the town does own that property right now. And there was a master plan, concept plan that was developed a few years ago. We are going to be talking about that a little bit more. I think a lot has changed in the downtown region since that concept plan was designed. And so some of those recommendations still make sense. Some of them may not. And so that is one of the areas that the consultants looked at, and we'll be making some more recommendations. We certainly want to do a couple of things. We want to keep some connectivity with our greenways in that area. And, you know, as we see throughout the town, you know, a lot of trees and some of our really natural areas are being developed. And so that may be a space that we want to find a use for that doesn't require the removal of all those trees. But if there's some way for us to kind of keep some of that natural experience and still leverage our existing resources, that may be something we look at in the future. But the town does own that property, and we hope to continue to plan for the use of that in the future.
Great, thank you, Leanne. Let's move on.
See if my microphone, all right, yes, I'm working, great. So just to really quickly follow up on the first question about the property north of Ting, there is currently a rezoning petition in, and you can kind of track that and the progress and look at what all they've submitted with that on the interactive development map that the town maintains whenever we get a new petition in or have a project that's going to our planning board and town council. So you can check that out on there.
Great, thank you, Matt. So let's move on to the next guiding principle. And Eric is going to take this one on for us.
Okay, thanks, Shweta. Good evening, everyone. So I'll be talking about the Greenway recommendations, and a big component of that is this guiding principle of connectivity. As you all are well aware, there are existing greenways in Holly Springs, and some really nice ones, and plans to build more. And there's a lot of gaps. There's a lot of greenways that could benefit from greater connectivity across the network, as well as connectivity into parks and destinations. And that connection doesn't just stop in Holly Springs. There's a lot of opportunities to connect to some really great trails and park systems in the neighboring jurisdictions of Cary and Apex and down south to Harnett County. And then some of those areas also include nationally significant trails such as the East Coast Greenway and the American Tobacco Trail. So we're looking for connections to those in addition to more local connections. Design standards really refers to having universal design standards for the trails. I'll be talking a little bit more here shortly about the different types of bike facilities. It's not just greenways, but there's some other off-road and on-road biking facilities that have standard or universal standards of construction, and we're recommending that Holly Springs adopts the universal design standard and also looks for more opportunities to leverage their policies to work with private developers and get some more developer-built trails on the ground. Community awareness really refers to just being well-informed. We learned in the community engagement that greenways are beloved and people want more, but we also learned that one of the main reasons folks from the community don't access greenways more than they currently do is for lack of awareness. They don't always know where the trailheads are or where the greenways go to. And so there's a lot of different ways to accomplish that. And one of them is just more signage and wayfinding opportunities. And then I mentioned partnerships with developers. That's happening to a degree, and we all know the community continues to grow, and there's some there's some policy recommendations that we'll be making in the plan that we think the town can implement to get even more greenways built and find better ways to connect the developer-built greenways to the system. And then funding support is an obvious concern for any of these recommendations, and we're recommending that there's funding being set aside, not just for the construction of these recommendations, but also the maintenance of future greenways. Next slide, please. So this is a similar map that we saw earlier in terms of the base map. So the orientation that Shweta provided earlier, it would be the same. Future 540 runs on the top of the map across, on the northern portion of town. And then Highway 55 kind of bisects the map. And then, east of that is downtown, kind of in the center of town there. And then obviously you've got your different parks and lakes and recreation areas such as Bass Lake and Sunset Lake. So hopefully that's helpful to orient you to the map. So the way that these proposed greenways have worked, and I'll talk a little bit about, I'll address Sharrow and the different trail facilities here in the next few slides, but also talk a little bit about our hierarchy of our recommendations, much like you would. Can you actually move to the hierarchy slide, please, Shweta? So much like you would design a road network for anywhere, you would have your interstates, and then you'd have several other roads like arterial and connector roads feeding into the interstates, and then your local roads feeding into those, creating that network. So our community connectors really are those highways that cut across the entire town and provide regional connections, whereas the destination connectors and the neighborhood connectors provide those more localized connections within the town of Holly Springs. So can you go back to the map? So looking at the map from that hierarchy, the big bold lines that you're seeing running roughly east-west and north-south, those are our community connectors. Those are kind of the highways, if you will, of our Greenway recommendations. And so back to the earlier question about Ting Park and the connections under 55, one of the northernmost community connectors that Shweta is pointing at, that we're looking at those connections because we see that as a great opportunity to bring people across from the city limits or town limits, connecting to Apex and their greenway system, and coming across more of a natural corridor into the destinations like Ting Park, and then the Arbor Creek Greenway, moving all the way across towards Sunset Lake and connecting into Cary's Greenway system. So that's just an example of what a community connector could do. And I'd like to also mention that all of these recommendations have a combination of different facility types. So it's not only greenways, there's also some side path recommendations and some on-road facilities like share rows and bike lanes, which I'll talk about here soon. And then I should also mention all these corridors include both existing planned and our recommendations. So some of these routes are already on the ground. If you can see the difference between the dotted and the bold lines is what's proposed and what's existing. So the bold line, the green bold line is an existing greenway that's around Bass Lake that Shweta is pointing at. And then off of that, you have a dotted line, which would be a proposed greenway. And the same thing goes with the magenta line. That's for our side paths. It's both proposed is the dotted line and existing is a solid line. And I know it's a lot of information to absorb, but as Shweta mentioned with the other map, we'll make sure this is available for folks to look at and spend a little bit more time with, because these are, we've spent a lot of time looking at all the different plans, the future land use plans, the existing conditions. We've gotten, we've met with all the jurisdictions that neighbor Holly Springs to get familiar with their greenway plans. We've met with different staff members from transportation and public works to get a better sense of future road projects and ways that we can kind of leverage other types of development and projects that will soon be happening in Holly Springs. Next slide, please. Next. So these are the different facilities. These are a few of the different facilities to help you guys understand. I think we're all familiar with the Greenway. Really, the difference with the Greenway, and one of the reasons it's so popular, is that it's a wider path. It's typically anywhere between 10 and 14 feet wide. A lot of towns will designate or they'll make sure that all their greenways are a specific number, like 12 feet, for instance. These are popular because they're usually further away from roads, often in natural corridors, and they provide enough space for multiple different user types. So they're really family friendly, and people love them. That's a big reason why they're so popular. Side paths are what you see in the middle of the screen. Those are closer to roadways, often within the right of way of a road. And they're generally about 10 feet, no more than 10 feet wide. They also provide enough space for multi-use in both directions of traffic. One of the advantages of these is they're closer to, they provide more direct connections to transit facilities, as well as commercial areas and some of the kind of key destinations that we access on our current road systems. And then share rows is what you see in the far right. That's an on-road facility, much like a bike lane, but it's actually sharing the road with the vehicle traffic. It doesn't have a designated lane. And these are only recommended in lower volume traffic roads, as well as lower speed limit roads, just for safer, for a safer experience for bikers and cars. Next slide, please. So I just quickly wanted to show you a few kind of renderings, illustrations of what some of these recommendations could look like. This is kind of before and after photos. So Raleigh Street, obviously the before is the left-hand side of the picture, And then on the right-hand side of the picture is an illustration of what a share row could look like on Raleigh Street, which would be our recommendation because there's really not enough right-of-way or property to develop a side path or a greenway, but we believe that the conditions are safe enough given the low volume of traffic and the low speed limit that you could accommodate a share row through this residential area and it would be safe and enjoyable. And then Center Street is an important connection east-west across downtown. And so bringing people off Raleigh Street heading towards the Mims property or, you know, the library or some of the other cultural centers in Holly Springs, as well as downtown Main Street. This road currently is wide enough to accommodate, you know, both directions of traffic as well as parking. And there's enough right away where you could actually build a side path to create, you know, a safer environment for bicycles and pedestrians. And then downtown, we had a lot of conversation about this. There was some concern about making recommendations of sharing the sidewalks with bikers and pedestrians and people, you know, sitting down for lunch or outside of a restaurant. So we recommend that this become a designated dismount zone. It's much like you would see on a college campus with proper signage and icons and a few features like a bike rack and even a bike repair station. People would be encouraged to get off their bike, to dismount their bike and either park it in the bike rack or walk it down the Main Street road to minimize some of the conflict with walkers and other kind of pedestrian activities in downtown. Next slide, please. I guess if I'll stop, if there's any more questions about some of our recommendations and the different trail types and anything that I presented.
Yeah, Eric, we've got a number of questions over on the questions bar. We're going to get through as many of these as we can, and we'll be responding to any others through online format. But one of the questions was, have Greenway connections been prioritized based on cost?
Yes, the community connectors, the larger kind of crosstown connections that we looked at, we're providing an implementation spreadsheet to the town as part of our plan, and it looks very closely at different segments of, you know, what it would require to implement that recommendation, and you know, we have a range of costs of what it costs for greenways and side paths and share rows. So we're providing that information, and you know, it's not always as simple as, you know, what's the cheapest option. Sometimes it depends on you know, what's existing, what's planned, where the funding is. You know, some of these recommendations can seek federal funding because they're transportation corridors. Some of them are more kind of local state funding. So there's not really a simple answer to that, but I'd just say that, of course, funding is always something we consider in our recommendations, and we try to find corridors that make the most sense or the most realistic for implementation.
And Eric, how about the timeline associated with the proposed Greenway network? Yeah,
that's another great question, and can be hard to answer. Some of this stuff is opportunistic, you know, and it would be built in phases. So obviously, you know, Matt and Leanne and their team, they're already working on several different phases of greenways, and those are included in our corridors. And then there's already some stuff built. So in some ways, you know, there's stuff already to work with, and it's a combination of like filling in those gaps between existing and proposed and funded trails. So there might be certain community connectors that are a little bit more feasible based on what's already built and what's already planned and funded for. Sorry if that's not a real specific answer.
If I can add a little bit to that, one of the goals of having an updated Greenway map is, as everybody knows, there's a ton of development currently going on in Holly Springs. And if we can leverage developer funds to build those greenways as development is occurring, those tend, or in my mind, are going to be some of our priority connectors. So when we've got a robust plan that we know is going to make those connections, then we can get the development community to help support the cost of building those greenways. Those, in my mind, sort of become our opportunities to get those done quicker as well.
Yeah, thanks, Leanne. That's a good reminder. That's another kind of variable in our recommendations. We're looking at, where some of that future development is, specifically, commercial areas that we already know the town is going to be able to leverage some developer-built greenways, which will make this kind of phased approach much more realistic. We looked at Cary and their model and, other neighboring jurisdictions, and they've been able to get a lot of greenways built through that model. And so there's some successful examples nearby.
Thank you, Eric. I think we do have one more question here that we can take. Are you going to get neighborhood input for the greenways or provide fencing or anything to keep out of people's yards? We can definitely leverage a little bit of community engagement process that we have already been through. And for any projects that are upcoming, maybe Leanne, you can add a little bit of community engagement piece with individual projects.
Sure. So, when we are updating this Greenway map, we really are looking at, again, sort of those undeveloped areas whenever possible. And in some cases, some of these greenways, when we talk about the timeline, will likely not be developed until there's redevelopment in some of those areas, just depending on where those connections are. But to reassure, we will always engage the public as we make these recommendations for some of our greenways to get your feedback, listen to your concerns, work with private property owners to really minimize the impact. We want to be good neighbors. We want neighbors to embrace and enjoy and benefit from the greenways. And so we will do what we can to try to work with the private property owners and the neighbors, of course, in all of our greenway projects. Are we going to be able to be off private property at all times? Not likely, but we will certainly work and address what we can in those areas that will require some private property and easement acquisition, and engage you early and often in that process so that you're aware of what will occur.
And Leanne, I just wanted to add to that and a little bit about the process for designing and developing greenways and next steps. So first of all, we like to work with willing and excited property owners more than anything. And then, there's a lot of questions around some very specific design elements, whether that's the type of trail surface or small pocket parks, water fountains. This is a very, very high level network plan. So the next steps would be to take a lot of these segments, the priority segments that Eric talked about, and develop what we call feasibility studies for those. So instead of looking at a town-wide network plan, we would be zooming in on some specific corridors and starting to look at where does that trail actually sit. Right now, it's a big fat line and it's a meaningful line, but it's a mile wide, and we want a trail that's more like 10 to 12 feet wide. So that's the next phase where we'll be answering a lot of those questions and talking about design standards and the actual alignment of the trail and property acquisitions. So, and at that time, as Leanne said, we would be engaging communities, neighborhoods, and property owners. And Eric, if you've got anything to add to that process as well.
Yeah, no, I appreciate everyone's input because it's helpful to kind of remind me sometimes. But I would just say that, you got some great examples in Holly Springs. So Utley Creek isn't a good example of a feasibility study. So that's something we're including on the kind of more high level community connector corridor. And then, you know, the town is taking that the next step in really coming up with design and construction documents that help make all the decisions of costs and material types and the exact alignment of the trail. So there are multiple different layers of, you know, taking a concept and getting it on the ground. And, you know, our network really aims at providing that kind of network, and it would be a phased approach. So, and the only last thing I wanted to mention was a question about natural surface trails. On this particular plan, we're only making recommendations for paved trails, greenways, side paths, and then some of the on-road facilities. The mountain biking trails and the natural surface trails would be more appropriate for larger pieces of property. A lot of times we're working with stream corridors and kind of less right of way, which isn't always suitable for mountain biking trails in our particular plan.
All right, well, it's about time we move on to the next guiding principle. So if there's any unanswered questions, we will try to tackle those at the end.
Okay, the next guiding principle is financial sustainability. And the goal here is to really focus on, because the town is growing so fast and for the department to keep up with the growth, it's important that they have a good understanding of their operational costs that ties to their capital costs. So incorporating a cost of service and an ownership model that what both direct costs and indirect costs to not only develop a amenity or facilities and programs, but also where the funding will come from so they don't get overextended. The next element is to look at establishing cost recovery goals for programs and facilities based on revenue capacity, as well as the ability to look at levels of exclusive use over a general taxpayer in relationship to facilities. Also look at evaluating the existing fee structure to incorporate direct and indirect costs, and setting a cost recovery goal that matches the value system of the community. Also looking at diversified funding sources outside of taxes and user fees to help support the operations and capital costs associated with this plan. And then looking at mutually beneficial partnerships. So typically a community like Holly Springs would have public-public partnerships, public not-for-profit partnerships, and public-private working to help provide services, facilities, programs, trails, whatever it might be, and making sure that those are mutual benefit to both the town and also to the partner.
The next guiding principle is a commitment to protection of natural resources. So another theme that we heard strongly, especially in the last public input meeting that you all attended, was about protecting natural resources. So as parks are developed, as greenway trails are constructed, how do we plan to minimize the impact to natural resources, since there is such a culture of ecological and environmental richness within the town? So we're establishing a goal to conserve 30% of parkland as undisturbed open space. So of the total amount of parkland that the city owns, 30% of that is going to be reserved to protect natural resources. And of course, we would want that land to be of high ecological value and functionality. We also have a goal to maximize sustainability practices, and that's across design, construction, maintenance, and operations. So a very system-based approach to sustainability. And then the Parks and Recreation Department has a great opportunity not only to model environmental awareness, but also to educate the public on environmental awareness and connect people to nature. So one of the core program areas we are recommending is around environmental programs to raise environmental awareness. And then finally, we're promoting a cross-sector approach to protection of natural resources. So this means collaborating with the planning department and with other departments or agencies or groups within the town who are very focused on conserving natural resources or, for example, expanding tree canopy coverage across the town. So the last guiding principle and set of recommendations is seeking excellence in all we do. Excellence is hard to find because it's exceptional, and being exceptional is difficult. But when we met with the town, when we met with the community members and staff, we saw such a commitment to excellence in both the attitude and the work that your recreation professionals do on a day-to-day basis. And we thought that it was actually possible in the town to seek excellence in all that they do. So the first recommendation to achieving this is implementing best practices in planning and design of parks. The document goes into a lot more detail, but we want to make sure we're establishing a set of design standards. So moving forward, the town is promoting excellence through things like CPTED, which is crime prevention through environmental design, addressing deferred maintenance in each of the parks, making sure that all parks are ADA compliant and inclusive, and then including wayfinding signage and other branding across all of the town parks. And one of these design strategies is to balance uniqueness with consistency of facilities. So when you go to a Town of Holly Springs park, you want to say, I want to go to that park with fill in the blank. It's unique, it's exciting, it makes you want to continue to come back. Yet you want to know that you're at a Town of Holly Springs park. So you know that because the site furnishings are consistent, because there's a consistency of wayfinding signage and entry monumentation, because there's a certain brand and color palette, and it ties all of the parks to the one Town of Holly Springs system. And I'm going to turn it over to Leon to talk about a few other things on an operational perspective that will help the town be excellent.
Okay, just basically focusing on innovation and technology and adaptability, really looking at the local and national and global challenges that are associated with how to operate in the most efficient manner using technology. Also looking at innovation in programming and how to activate spaces, and making sure that as they move forward, that they really set themselves up for a national program called CAPRA, which is National Recreation and Park Association has a accreditation program which identifies 155 different levels of expectations and standards for all levels of operations of a park and recreation system. And it's a very difficult process to achieve, but it also demonstrates to the staff and to the community that you have a best practice organization that is really following best practice guidelines for management of parks and recreation infrastructure, programs, services, and funding.
Great, thank you, Leon. So these are the site-specific recommendations for your existing parks facilities. And this is basically saying that the town has been doing an excellent job maintaining and taking care of the facilities that they already have. And in keeping with the guiding principle of excellence, we want to continue doing what we have been doing successfully. So we will go through these recommendations one by one. Some of the overall recommendations, Rachel already touched on, making sure we are complying with CPTED guidelines and placemaking aspects, making sure there is a consistency of site furnishings and elements that show that these are Town of Holly Springs parks, but at the same time creating enough unique aspects at each of these parks. So for Womble Park, we are recommending enhancing the current 2 entrances to the park. We heard a lot about constraints with the existing parking area. So looking at parking expansion for this park, improved site lighting, And then looking at amenity renovations as some of the amenities are being used and they aged over time. So looking at turf field renovations, restroom renovations, and possible band shell relocation so that band shell can be used more effectively for small scale performances and programming. For Veterans Park, we are recommending engaging youth and adding amenities to activate the park, especially the northern section where the War on Terror Memorial has been implemented on the northern side. Adding a trailhead here to make sure the wayfinding signage helps people understand where the greenways are going and connecting these park destinations along those greenways. Trimming vegetation and maintaining sight lines to improve the eyes on the park concept. For Jones Park, again, we are recommending a trailhead connection and greenway connection, parking expansion. Turtle Pond, we heard a lot about that, how turtles bathe in that pond, and we want to create a unique opportunity there for environmental education piece. So people, while using the greenway, they can take a pause, look at the pond, but also understand the value of environment, of saving wildlife and enjoying the wildlife along the way. And some of the technical aspects include addressing the runoff and drainage and additional shelter area at this park. Ting Park is one of the very popular regional destination in Holly Springs. For this park, we are suggesting a destination teen space, possibly across from the soccer fields next to the stadium. Creating that indoor, outdoor adventure place where kids will, or the teenagers specifically, will be able to enjoy and call it their own space. Teenagers are always attracted by technology, and so we want to recommend looking at some of the interesting latest technologies that are around. So creating programs around esports or hackathons, VR technologies and cloud-based platforms to attract these new youth within Holly Springs, making sure they are outside, but at the same time, attracting them through these technological advances. Smart Park is that similar concept to attract these teenagers, but at the same time also leveraging, creating smaller pilot projects for the town to include the technology in the regular park maintenance. So that would include irrigation operations, lighting, making smaller projects where you are leveraging solar amenities like solar powered benches or umbrellas, shelters, taking advantage of rainwater capturing for your landscape irrigation. And all of these can be tracked on using the technological platforms to maintain the efficiencies of park operations. And then also looking at the public-private partnerships. Ting Park has already been successful in creating that for Holly Springs through a partnership with Ting. But we want to also encourage that, maybe create some kind of restaurant or outdoor spaces where all these new teenagers can spend their time, socialize. So leveraging that public-private partnership, extending it to the youth within Holly Springs would be something that we would be looking at. Some of the other recommendations for this would include full-size basketball courts, so replacing the ones that are currently there at the parking lot. Permanent building with restroom, offices, and storage in place of the trailer building that currently exists on site. Making sure there are greenway connections available from Ting Park off of 55 that we already touched on earlier in the presentation. Enhance the main entrance plaza and create a sense of arrival to the park. And then internal park signage. There are many amenities within this park, and through branding and park signage, we can really enhance that placemaking aspect for this park. For Sug Farm, we are recommending validating the current master plan within the limits of the conservation easement this park has. Just making sure the master plan that town currently has is in line with the community needs and anything, making sure that if the needs have changed, the plan corresponds to the newer needs of the community. Evaluate the existing barn structures, either for new programming aspect for Sug Farm, repave the entrance road, and then possibly creating a permanent farmers market pavilion, because this is a larger park. It has the history of being agricultural site. We are recommending a permanent farmers market at this location with a community garden and extending that farm to table programming at this park. For Bass Lake, we are looking at facility expansion for dedicated event space, and then also expanding the current environmental education facility so that there are dedicated spaces for the event planning as well as for the environmental education programming. The park is already on the list of environmental education centers of North Carolina, and we want to leverage that opportunity and increase the programming associated with that. We will be also looking at parking reconfiguration and expansion at the current site. This is a very popular park. People want to use the trails around the lake and enjoy themselves, and we want to make sure we have the ability for people to park and use the facility as well. For cultural center, we are recommending relocating and expanding the farmers market area. So we will be looking at a permanent larger farmers market at Sug Farm, but at the same time, we will have the presence of satellite farmers market within the downtown area, as well as another satellite market maybe west of 55 to create that equitable access to healthy food and access to programs for the whole community. We heard a lot about how the space is constrained at the cultural center for storage and office space needs. So our recommendation is to really analyze that aspect and then expand the various programs and amenities to the adjacent MIMS properties so that the storage and office space needs can also be addressed with that. And then the last recommendation for cultural center is to collaborate with Wake County for potential building expansion of this area. For Hunt Center, we are recommending playground replacement. This is a very popular playground, as we saw there. All the summer camps and the little kids programs use the playground to the fullest capacity. But the existing playground, it's at the end of its life cycle. We want to make sure the new one that gets installed is ADA compliant with shade structure for kids to enjoy that throughout the day when they spend their time here. Improved controlled access for the building, renovations to community room, gymnasium, and locker rooms, and then maximizing the program capacity by creating flexible spaces throughout the center. And then repurposing the outdoor spaces or the pit with new amenities and extend those outdoor programs here. So with that, I would take a pause here and we can open it up for questions.
Yes, and I had saw one question there about the sustainability and the consideration to leave 30% of the acreage as undeveloped, and why not take that a step further and do a restorative effort on the land if it had been previously impacted by maybe a invasive species or previous development that just kind of fell out or something. I think that's definitely an option. It's part of our town's recently adopted or updated strategic plan, and that kind of governs how we make all of our decisions as a town. One of the items within there is an initiative for sustainability, and we're really looking deeply at what that means and how we can approach it from as many different angles as possible. So I think that as we look at these sites, like the Cass Holt property that we recently purchased, as well as some land up in the Carolina Springs new development up on Woods Creek Road. I think those would be great opportunities for the type of natural restoration or natural education and natural play that I believe that you're kind of suggesting in that. So I would definitely get behind that.
Great, thank you, Matt.
So we've got a question about dog park plans in any of the existing parks. The dog park was one of the desired amenities and one that's recommended for any future development at parks. Right now, most of the parks are heavily programmed. There's not a lot of opportunity for expansion except I believe the open space at Ting Park, which is really going to be focused around technology and some sort of public-private partnership with some revenue generating potential. But because dog parks were so high on the priority list, I know that it's something that this plan considers a priority for future development at any of the vacant parcels of land that the town currently owns or any future land to be acquired.
Yeah, Rachel, just to add a little more information, the town is currently working on a dog park at Sug Farm. Unfortunately, we are several months behind in that project, but we are in the midst of a new restroom facility and a dog park. So hang tight, and the town of Holly Springs will have its first dog park shortly, as soon as we can get our contractor to finish out up there. And then certainly, again, looking at other areas within the town as these park and recommendations come to light.
There's also a question about whether our recommendations would include completion of existing parks before starting new ones. And the good news is you all get to help us make that recommendation. When you move to the questionnaire, you're going to help us prioritize the items. You have the ability to pick up and drag and drop various improvements where you see them prioritized. For priorities in terms of what we recommend they go back to the guiding principles, and as long as they're reinforcing those, there's also going to be a list of prioritizing criteria in the master plan, but right now we really want to hear what the community's priorities are.
There was one more question in the beginning of the presentation about expanding the meaning of plazas and what the view of what they will look like and offer to the community. So just to quickly touch base on that, plazas are the small scale green spaces within more urban areas, specifically like mixed use developments or office developments, where people can be outside in small spaces and socialize. So they can be the spaces around small shops or areas that are closer to the office buildings. So when people are outside, they can take a walk and spend their lunchtime outside, out in the sun. So typically the plazas or the greens would be the places in the more denser or urban areas.
Matt, did you want to ask about or answer a question, one of the connectivity
Sure.
questions?
Yeah, I didn't know if we wanted to move forward or not, but I'll take this one real quick. So there's a question about connectivity, kind of on the east side of town, Sunset Lake Road, near the Westcott community. we've had several conversations with community members out there, and there are several little Greenway stubs that don't seem to go anywhere at this point. We have those little stubs all over town, and that was one of the first things that we noticed, and that McAdams' team noticed. And so once we kind of navigate you guys to the public input page and the larger version of the maps, hopefully you'll be able to access those without any trouble. And we actually do have a number of Greenway locations shown around there that would connect those stubs to nowhere. And hopefully what that will mean is both north-south connectivity kind of between Sunset Oaks and Westcott, going down to Creekside and Carrington, but also the east-west connections to get us to the Cary, town of Cary Greenway system, and then further over towards the intersection of Holly Springs Road and Sunset Lake Road, where we have shopping and perhaps other recreational opportunities.
I know there are a lot of questions around the greenways, and I'm so excited that there is so much interest. And, as we saw in the survey that went out across the town, most recently for this plan, and then a couple of years ago as well, the community really embraces the connectivity, the walkability, and greenways. But with those come, lots of challenges, right? And I know there's some questions around private property and whether or not we'll engage the community. And as we've answered, certainly that is our goal in order to try to, one, leverage undeveloped land first. But we do need to make those connections to the neighborhoods and shopping plazas that are already in existence. And so trying to work with the private property owners in order to make that connection is something that we will always strive to do. And we're glad to see, again, around the interest, but also the concern, about infringing on private property rights. Another issue that frequently comes up is around safety on our greenways. And certainly that is something that Town of Holly Springs takes very seriously. But we also believe Holly Springs is one of, the safest communities. And so we will model our policies, procedures, our amenities, whether they're call boxes, whether it's bike patrols with our police department in the future, whether it's Greenway monitors and maybe a volunteer, type of program. As our Greenway system develops, we will evolve our staffing and monitoring and our safety measures, if you will, to ensure that we create a positive experience and address those concerns in the community. Again, Holly Springs is kind of in its beginning stages of really having a networked Greenway section, and as we continue to develop that, we will continue to look at best practices. Eric or Shweta, if there are any other best practices that you have recommended relative to Greenway safety that you want to share, that may either come through as recommendations or things that the town should consider as we continue to build out that network, that would be helpful to add to the conversation.
Yeah, much like anything, any kind of features on greenways, whether it's water fountains or benches, a lot of it depends on the built environment, like what's already existing and where the greenway is in reference to residential, commercial kind of land use. But I would say that, some kind of general strategies that work is to try to not make real long segments of greenways where there's not, easy places to get on and off the trails. In certain circumstances, it's appropriate, and sometimes it's not, to have lighting. I think, having a lot of eyes on the trails, sort of the strategies that Leanne was mentioning, whether it's, getting some of the police department out on bikes, or having, local trail stewards or people from the community that are really active in particular parts of the system. I think really the best success is just a system that's really kind of, there's a sense of ownership and pride locally. And then, like I said, some of the design features of making sure people aren't on a 3-mile stretch of greenway where they feel kind of trapped if something ever were to happen. That's both from a safety and emergency standpoint. So, you know, I don't think any of the recommendations we would be making would be that type of situation. But there's a lot of little strategies that you can implement to kind of minimize some of those risks. And then I guess the other question that was floating around and comes up a lot is about parking. It's always a consideration and concern. And I would just say that, you know, one of the advantages of having this network and larger connectivity that we're really hoping to achieve is that it can leverage existing parking lots and create a situation where people don't have to park at every, you know, the beginning of every trail, but rather they could access the system by parking at, you know, some of the larger parking lots that already exist at Ting Park or Wombly, or even, you know, a commercial area. So that's always a good strategy. Leveraging, you know, existing town-owned parking lots, or even having partnerships with larger commercial areas where you can designate a certain amount of spaces for that, you know, recreational facility. And then obviously there's certain situations where you build a new greenway and there's a brand new trailhead, and you should plan and build, or, you know, consider a certain amount of parking spaces. But, you know, like I said, if you can achieve the connectivity, it helps minimize the need for large parking areas specifically for that trail.
Great, thank you, Eric. We had one more question here about will the greenways be removed from our yards after the new greenways are approved? I think they are talking about easement swap kind of situation where some of the property owners already have easements identified on their properties. And if the greenway is not going through that designated easement, the route has changed in our greenway plan, what is the solution? And I think that's what will happen probably. The ideal situation will be there will be an easement swap condition. So that will come into play when the detailed construction drawings are being looked at, where the exact route of that trail is, how much easement or right of way you need for that particular section of the greenway that is on your property. Matt, do you want to add anything to that?
No, it's essentially, you know, that's kind of getting into a lot of very small detail that we would want to have a little bit more context. You know, I think that looking at this map, it's very easy, and I know that you guys have only seen kind of that little small version of the map, that is. But once you get into it, I mean, it's very easy to kind of pick out your property on the map and then kind of consider, all right, well, this is how it impacts my neighborhood and everything. These routes, you know, they're meant to be not set in stone as it is, and it's like they mentioned earlier, we haven't done a full, you know, feasibility study on each one of these locations. So what the next step is once we get these priorities worked through, we can start working on those more exact locations. But really, until we get into that stage, you know, we're not going to be able to necessarily answer that question with 100% certainty.
Great, thank you. Let's move on to our next slide here, which is pretty much our closing session. So we have, as Rachel mentioned earlier, we have a publicinput.com platform for you all to take a short survey. It's related to all the recommendations that we shared with you and it's asking priority questions. So it's about ranking what you think should be the first priority, second priority, based on what your needs are for each of these recommendations. And so we will have the link and the QR code available for you on the town's website. So you have until the end of the year to take this survey and let us know what you think your priorities are for this master plan recommendations portion. So Leanne, I'll turn it over to you.
So as we wrap up tonight, we will stay on a little bit longer to answer any more questions that you all might have. But this was our second public meeting in this year-long process to develop our 10-year Parks and Recreation and Greenways Master Plan. So our consultants here will compile all the feedback that we receive tonight and through the next couple of weeks with the priority ranking that we're asking you to do through the public input site. And they will update the recommendations and our action items for our staff and present to council. So town council ultimately will be the approving body to look at these recommendations that our consultants have reviewed and put forth, obviously with public input and research. And then town council will approve, or we hope to get them to approve, our plan the end of February or the beginning of March. And once we have that adoption, that becomes really our 10-year work plan for the Parks and Recreation Department. So again, this is a broad-based plan looking at these recommendations, but it really gives us something to strive for over the next 10 years. So now is your chance to kind of add your thoughts or your feedback. Share with us your priorities. Always Matt and myself, and we also have Adam Huffman, our assistant director, also on the call this evening. Many of you have worked with him through the years. So if you have suggestions or comments, don't hesitate to reach out to us. This is the opportunity for you all to weigh in, because we want this to benefit the community. We want your input to make sure that this serves the community of Holly Springs. So please go ahead and take that survey. Shweta, if you want to put that link back up and help us create those priorities. But we do appreciate your input. And again, staff will stay on the line a little bit longer. If there are any other questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A chat, or you can also contact Matt, Adam, or myself in the Parks and Recreation office. We're happy to answer any questions, and we're here to serve you. Don't see any other immediate questions coming in, but we will hang by. But again, hopefully some of those folks can go ahead and take that survey as well.
And play some holiday themed elevator music while we wait.
Just don't ask us to sing, Matt.
I was gonna have everybody start humming.
We do have one more question here. The Little Trail by Mims, is it open to public? Without any wayfinding from Main Street, it feels weird walking through the church and parking area to get to it. Good question.
Yes, so that little greenway, that natural trail that's back in there is part of the Mims property. It is public property and it is available for public use. Matt, I know we've talked about adding some additional signage and kind of formalizing it. The challenge is you do have to walk through private property in that parking lot over by the church and the Mims house to access it. And so one of our goals before we open it to the public is to create a more direct public access. But Matt, I don't know if there's any other insight you want to weigh in on.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of touches on a concern that we have kind of town-wide about wayfinding. And, you know, I know that we've got our, some of our roadside wayfinding worked out recently, and we'd probably try and match that style to a certain extent. But yeah, for trailheads and park locating, wayfinding is definitely going to be part of the recommendations with this plan, because yeah, I mean, you're right, you go walking back there and it does, you kind of feel like you're in the wrong place sometimes, and that's not a great thing to have in a town park.
We do try to mulch it once every year or so to try to keep people on a quarter-mile path, but as he alluded to, it does get overgrown at times.
And there was another question about proposed timeline for projects to be completed by. You know, this is a 10-year plan, but I think, as it was mentioned earlier, really your job in completing the surveys to help us prioritize how these projects get done and kind of the order that they get done in. You know, projects cost money, and we have to see where if the town is going to fund it, where that money comes from, and if the development community is going to fund it, where can we get that to occur? As Eric mentioned, you know, we're trying to lean on the development community as much as possible when it comes to construction of greenways. That's likely to also carry over to the donation of future parkland in accordance with the park search areas map that was also shown. So I think it kind of works in our favor on both fronts. But yeah, there's not necessarily a set timeline for any of the projects at this point. Hopefully we can get the first series of projects rolling here pretty quickly, though, after the new year or shortly into 2021.
Doesn't appear that we have any more questions. So I do think our meeting was scheduled to end at 8 o'clock. We can go ahead and wrap up the meeting for the evening. But again, those that are still on the line, if you do have additional questions, don't hesitate to reach out to the Parks and Recreation Department. We are here to serve you. So please reach out with any additional questions. And thanks for everybody taking the time tonight to join us to hear about the exciting things that are in the plans for Holly Springs Parks and Recreation. So happy holidays, everybody, and thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.